Today we're taking a look at the Flamma FX100. How does it sound for rock and metal? What's it like to use? And is it worth it? The unit itself is built well. It has a metal construction, which I wasn't expecting for the price. The foot switches feel good and the expression pedal moves smoothly, although to enable it, the switch is a little bit hard to press and you also kind of have to move the pedal before you do. It's a little weird, but when you get used to it, it's fine. You got a 2.5-inch color LCD. It could be a little bit bigger if I'm honest, but it's not too bad. You get 3 knobs here. 2 of them also double up as buttons, whereas this one is just a global master. Underneath that, you get 9 LEDs to show you which block you're on and which ones are enabled. Underneath that, you get some buttons for various system functions, things like saving presets, going into play mode, tap tempo, that kind of thing. On the back, you get an auxiliary input, your main input, stereo outputs, a headphone output that's also stereo, a USB-B connection, which you also get the cable for connecting the FX100 to your PC for firmware updates and for editing patches and software. You also get, inexplicably separately, a micro USB connection for connecting to the PC and recording. I don't know why those are on 2 different outputs. It seems really inconvenient. You also don't get the cable for the micro USB recording out, so I'm not using it here. And you also get your power input, which is also the only way to turn the device on and off, as there's no power button. I simply cannot fathom why you would exclude a power button. It's not like they're expensive. It's not like there's not plenty of space on the device for it. Seems like a weird omission and it's a massive inconvenience. Interface usability of the board itself is fairly solid and straightforward. Your foot switches change your preset up and down. Holding this left one brings up a tuner, holding the right one brings up a looper. You can also change presets by turning the value knob while you're on the main screen. The mode knob moves you through each block in a given patch, and pressing it in will enable or disable that block. Value knob moves you through the different parameters in a block, and pressing in on it selects which parameter you're adjusting. You can adjust what the expression pedal does in a given preset by pressing the EXP button and changing the settings. You have a tap tempo button, but it not being on a foot switch kinda sucks. It's more of a use it as you're making a preset thing rather than something you're going to do on the fly. You also get a rhythm machine that plays drums. I haven't found it particularly useful. To save a preset, you hit the save button, use the mode and value knobs to rename the preset, and press save again. In the system menu, you can also adjust things like your input gain depending on the output of your pickups. You can also adjust things like screen brightness and the output volume of the digital recording if you're using that. The software suite makes dialing in tones significantly easier. You have a list of all of your presets on the left. Next to that, you have all of your blocks. Underneath that, you have all of the different parameters for a given block and all the different models you can select. On the top, you have a place to name and save your preset. To the right of that, you have the ability to change what the expression pedal does in the preset. To the right of that, you have buttons to change whether or not the cabinet simulation is on or off for a given output. You have the ability to turn on a global expression pedal volume whenever the expression pedal is not engaged in the preset. And you also have the ability to adjust your system functions from the software, which is really nice. One thing you can't do in the software that I really wish you could is move the blocks around in a given preset. For example, it'd be really nice if you could put the EQ before the amplifier rather than having to rely on the distortions and overdrives to tighten up a guitar tone. It'd also be nice to have these before the cabinet for a more accurate sound. But the cabinets being mono kind of explains why they don't do that, as the effects are the only stereo thing about the device. One thing you can do in the software that's really nice is you can load in your own impulse responses. So if you have, like I do, a backlog of like 20,000 different cabinets, you can get various different sounds. But again, that comes back to the cabinet block is in mono, so you can't mix different microphone sounds within the FX100 itself. This is a bummer because I like to mix microphones, things like MD421s and M160s, to get a best of both worlds. Another famous example is like pairing up SM57s on a cabinet. You can't do that. You have to have an IR shot with that microphone combination already if you want that sound. That's a massive bummer, and I really wish the cabinets were stereo purely and simply so I could mix the impulse responses on the device. Another bummer here is that the power amp simulation, whatever of it there is also tied to the cab block. So if you turn off the cab block to, say, run into the effects loop of power amplifier, if you're running into a solid state power amplifier, you're not going to get any tube power amp simulation there. Dialing in sounds on this thing isn't too hard, and there are some really good sounds to be had here. But some of the effects are simply broken, for lack of a better word. They either don't sound like the piece of gear they're trying to sound like, or they are just blatantly incorrect. Their Klon Overdrive model, for example, has way too much gain. It's like they modeled a blues driver inside and called it good. The Diesel Hagen on channel 3 doesn't even sound like amplifier distortion. It sounds like 3 digital distortions in a trench coat. The overdriven AC30 also has that problem where it doesn't behave like any distortion effect you would play through, be it a pedal or an amp. It just caves in a way that's wholly unnatural. I could go on, but there's only a handful of amps and effects in this thing that have that problem. Most of what's here sounds good, and they have some really interesting pieces of gear modeled in here that I would not have expected. Things like the BK Butler Tube Driver, Digitech Metal Master. They have a bunch of angle amps in here that aren't the Powerball. They have the Diesel Hagen, like I mentioned before. They have some Black Star. They have some 2-Rock, which is wild. It's a gear list that makes the broken models incredibly puzzling because everything else is so well flushed out. In a vacuum then, the FX100 seems to pack a pretty decent punch for the money, despite some quirks. But it doesn't exist in a vacuum. And there's some pretty stiff competition in both hardware and software at this price point. I don't have any hardware to test at the moment, but what I do have is software in and around the same price range. You can buy the FX100 for around $150, which happens to be around the same price as Neural DSP's Archetype Gojira, which is sitting at around €130. Audio 1111, which is typically around 151, but with some discount codes and various other sales that are going on, you can usually have it for around 100. Neither of these suites offer as wide a range of tones as the FX100, but what they do offer is typically of a very high quality, so it'll be interesting to test those out. But for me, the real kicker is testing this compared to various freeware options. I know from experience you don't need a lot of money to get some really good guitar tones. I started off just plugging in my guitar to a Rocksmith cable and plugging that directly to my PC and using free amps and VSTs. The amount of high quality tones you can get for free, it's insane. So for that, I'm going to be using one of the more popular options in Ignite Amp's Emissary, pairing that with a Cab IR free sample from Kick-Ass Audio. For this comparison, I didn't dial any of the tones to sound like one another because I didn't want to dumb everything down to whatever the lowest common denominator was. I started off with the FX100 and pulled up the Devin Townsend inspired patch that I made on pretty much day one when I got the device. For Archetype Gojira, I'm using a Devin Townsend inspired patch that I've had for a while. 1111 was similar story where I already had a preset and I'm using that, but it only does amp and cab simulation, so I'm pairing that with some reverb and delay after the fact. They're both free effects, so it's not going to change the price comparison. Last but not least, with the Emissary and Kick-Ass Audio IR rig, I didn't have a preset, so I actually had to put in some work to emulate Devin Townsend here. I just dialed in something that sounded fairly modern high gain and then put some other more different freeware VSTs for delay and reverb after the fact to keep the price at zero and the sounds in the same ballpark. my ears in that comparison, the FX100 feels a bit dull. There's a lack of air in the high end and a lack of speaker resonance in the lows that leave you with this just uninspiring mid-range that sounds great in a mix, but doesn't necessarily feel great to play through. You can compensate for it a little bit in the EQ section, but none of the EQs have as many bands as I would want for it, and mediocre in's just going to give you mediocre out. All three of the other options have significantly more frequency content to work with in both the bass and the treble, as well as more dynamics in terms of their response to your playing. This is only one example, but the results here line up with my experience overall in the last few weeks. So where does that leave us with the Flamma FX100? There's some really great sounds to be had here, like that static X tone that I showcased in the intro sounds incredible, and it's quickly become my main tone, not only just on this device, but I'm actually using it in a song I'm working on as my main guitar tone, augmenting it with 1111. And that was something I just threw together in a late night jam session with nothing but my guitar and some headphones plugged in. I didn't have the software going at the time. Unfortunately, for every great sound this thing makes, it makes 2 or 3 meh ones or worse. The amount of effects and amps on here that actually sound good, let alone sound like what they're trying to sound like, is less than the total amount listed, and that's a huge bummer for the people who are actually going to be buying this thing. All in all, I'd say the FX100 is worth buying if you're fairly new to the world of effects and you're wanting to just figure out, hey, do I like wah? Do I like chorus? Do I like delay? Which amps do I like? But if you're more experienced with this stuff like me and you're just looking for a cheap practice rig, there's probably better options for around $150, be it a used Boss Katana, a used Line 6 Pod, like I said, freeware VSTs and a cheap cable to plug into your computer. There are probably better practice options than this. Thank you all for watching. I hope this was informative. Have a good one.